Welcome to the second episode of Hub Politics. Amanda, David, we made it through the first episode. They're having us back for a second. It's great to connect with you again.
No, I didn't get any tomatoes thrown at me for proverbially online, so I think we made it. Yeah, it's good.
I got lots of love, but I tend to get more love than hate on the interwebs. So
Uh,
I was happy with that. It was fun. Look forward to it.
yeah, great reaction from people. Someone told me that they were at a Hans Zimmer event in Toronto over the weekend, and they heard someone a couple of rows behind them talking about this new Hub podcast. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I'll take it. For those who missed last week's inaugural episode, let me just reintroduce Amanda Galbraith, the principal at Oyster Group, someone with deep experience in federal and local politics, and of course David Coletto, the founder and CEO of Abacus Data, one of the country's leading pollsters, someone who brings data and analysis to bear to help us understand the big ideas and trends shaping our politics. We're really fortunate at the Hub to have the two of them doing this weekly podcast with us to analyze and talk about what's happening in our politics, particularly in the aftermath of last week's return of Parliament that, for the first time, guys, had Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, mano a mano, in Parliament. We'll come to that in a minute, but Amanda, I want to start with you. Prime Minister Carney is in the Big Apple. He spoke to the UN General Assembly. According to media reports, there's a ton of interest in different business leaders and political leaders meeting Prime Minister Carney. I won't say it's Beatles mania, but there's obviously some buzz around Canada's new Prime Minister, particularly given his global standing, having been the former central banker in the UK and having deep connections and networks across Europe. Just to kick things off, what's your sense of how the trip's going so far?
I think as far as the audience that the prime minister wants to appeal to, it's a success for him. A personal opinion on his recognition of Palestine is a whole other matter. But I think as far as these international trips that we see the prime minister go on, it's clearly a place he's comfortable. I think it's his strong suit, and I think it demonstrates, sort of a heft that as a country we haven't had under the previous administration for quite a while. That being said, we are still a middle power with, I think, limited resources and tools at our disposal. We also saw this, if folks will recall, with Prime Minister Trudeau when he first came on board, right? Like he was on the cover of Vogue. It was, ooh, like people were swooning. I remember he came to City Hall to do like a joint press conference with the mayor Tory when I worked there, and it was insane. Like it was actually like Beatles mania. Every time I turned a corner, there was groups of women who were in tears, and I would come out because I was a staff, so I would come out of the mayor's office door to like set this, and people would be like, "Oh," and then I would walk on, they go, "Oh," and I'm like, "All right, come on." So I don't know if it's quite swooning, but I certainly think, given the previous administration, one, the bar was on the floor, but two, I think he is, one of the folks that are, this is his brethren, these are his people. He should be succeeding in these places. Now, do I think Canadians voted for a commitment to troops on the ground in Palestine? No, I don't. I think, making those kinds of promises in these international circuits, I don't think people hear them at home quite a bit. But if that ever were to come to force, I think it would be domestically quite problematic. So, do I think, yeah, tour de force for him? I think it's been a good couple days for him, but it should be. I think this is probably the place where he feels most comfortable, which is why, as I said last week on the pod, I think that we'll see him a lot on these international trips. I don't think we're going to see him in the House of Commons as much as we've seen his predecessors.
Yeah, let me just stay with you for a second, Amanda. You referred to what I think was a communications misstep, where he alludes to the possibility of Canadian troops playing some role in a post-Hamas stabilization force in Gaza. She tried to clean that up a bit yesterday, I think. But I want to ask you, as a professional communicator, how to think about the way the Prime Minister is talking. I think in particular, the speech he gave at the Council on Foreign Relations, there is clearly a juxtaposition with Prime Minister Trudeau, who I think it's fair to say kind of stayed in his lane when he talked publicly about politics and economics and ideas. Mark Carney seemingly likes to nerd out or wonk out a bit. Talk about the kind of upside and downside of a prime minister who at times sounds as much like a central banker as he does like the prime minister.
Yeah, it is. It's a challenge to cover for me because he gets into these, especially like I talked last week, my Friday, he gets into these like 45-minute monologues about all of the things he cares about, and he wants to lay out the narrative for it, and he doesn't do it in a little typical political way, which is inverted pyramid news first and then you go down the list of all of the reasons why you're doing it. Instead, he likes to tell a story, and but a very nerdy version of the story. What I think is interesting is we have a world leader who is, I think, interested in opining on or engaging in like big ideas internationally and globally, and we historically, I think, as a country in the last few decades have done a little less of that. Again, not particularly my political flavor for a lot of what he says internationally, but I do think that he probably feels good right now. I think he's got a lot of political grace from the Canadian public. I think Canadians like seeing him on stage next to um, you know, your Starmer, next to the head of the UN, et cetera, writ large. So that's to his benefit. But I think he's got to be very careful because just like with troops on the ground, there's actually domestic implications for a lot of what he
Yes.
talks about that he's not articulating internationally and he's not articulating to Canadians. And people will figure that out if these things get implemented. The other thing I think there's a risk of is he muses about things and deadlines and makes declarative statements as executives often do, right? You set a big goal and maybe you get 80% of the way there. That's fine for a corporation to do to a certain extent. In politics, like it's zero sum game. That's a fail, right? If you set expectations here and you get here, it doesn't work that way. So unless he flips the game entirely on its head, and maybe David can talk about the expectations, his ability to meet them or not, and Canadians' expectations of the prime minister. But I think the longer in the mandate, these kind of tendencies will become more problematic for him. But right now, I think Canadians are still pretty in love with him and the idea of him, as is the international community. So he's getting a lot of space.
Yeah, your point about grace is well taken. Let me turn to you, David. Take up the trip broadly if you want, but also, if you will, talk a bit about the decision to recognize the state of Palestine. What are the Canadian public's views, to the extent we can discern them? Is this
Mm.
about managing a big, wieldy, progressive coalition that Prime Minister Carney represents? Is it about demographic change in the country? We've seen a growing number of Arab and Muslim Canadians participating in our politics, of course, as full citizens. Is this uh, an effort on the part of the government to reflect some of those demographic characteristics more in Canadian foreign policy?
So yeah, I think first on the trip itself, I think I tried to watch and did watch a number of his events, and I think what became clear to me is yes, he is very comfortable going deep on a lot of things that I think past well, certainly the last prime minister probably wasn't, especially on economics, investment, and how to talk about that to an audience that I think would give investors a lot more confidence in Canada. So that's one audience I think that he can speak to pretty clearly, and I think Canadians, for the most part, particularly those who voted for him, believe he has that expertise. And so even if they don't understand what he's saying, in a way, that's a good thing because they've kind of delegated that to him and said, you go off and do that. But I think it also raises expectations that if you have if your brand is so innately built around the idea of competence and expertise and knowing how to do something maybe better than anybody else, and over time people don't start to see results, that might come to be a big liability. And so it's still not there, and there's still, I think most people are giving him enough kind of rope to try to change some of the things, but I think that's the risk. In terms of recognizing the state of Palestine, look, I think I there is probably politics involved. I'm always careful not to say everything is political because most times it is, but there are times where people make, what they believe are principled positions, and they make those for various reasons. But I do think that, we have seen one, there are more Muslim and Arab Canadians in Canada than there are, for example, Jewish Canadians. So in terms of just sheer number, if you just look at it from a purely political perspective, it certainly is something that might benefit the Liberals politically. There also seems to be some effort to build this kind of coalition where it's not just Canada, it's France, it's the UK, it's Australia, and so is this another way of sort of by creating this alliance in a way to put pressure on Israel, maybe actually an attempt to try to resolve the issue. You know, I'm not going to get into whether I thought it was a good idea or not. Polling that has been done so far suggests more people approve of this decision than not. Is this going to be the issue in which the vast majority of Canadians sit up and say, you know, I like Mark Carney or I like the government because of this decision? Not likely. But it is very emotional. And so it's going to create some polarization on both sides and leave most people in the middle wondering, you know, why. I think there has been over time increased empathy among Canadians towards what's going towards Gaza, towards the Palestinian people. They're seeing what's going on, and as a result, I don't think this was, at least politically, a risky decision. I know this is a politics podcast, um, but it doesn't mean he's not going to feel some pressure, both with a few members of his own caucus, as well as many people who think like Amanda, and I'm sure Sean, I don't know where you fall on this, who think this was just a really bad idea. Also, in the context of the United States calling out this as being a really bad decision, Marco Rubio, I think, going on a number of news programs over the last few days, just lambasting Canada and the UK for this decision, may not help in trying to create, you know, calm waters in terms of our trade relationship either.
Yeah, well said. Great analysis from both of you. We'll pivot to the first week of Parliament and some of the big developments we saw there. But if I can just say in parentheses, we spoke last week, Amanda and David, about how the Conservatives were positioning themselves in the new Parliament, the extent to which they were internalizing any of the signals from the last election. I have it on good authority that in recent years, the Conservatives had refused to pair off members of Parliament with Trudeau ministers when they traveled abroad, that they refused to, in effect, cooperate in a minority parliament. I know that in recent days, Conservative MPs have paired off with Carney government ministers who are in New York for the UNGA meeting. So take that as you will, but it may be evidence of a more cooperative Conservative Party after April's election. Talking about cooperation in Parliament, the week started with some news about the budget and ended with possibly explosive news about the Canadian Constitution. Why don't we start with the budget? I'll come to you first, David, because we were told the budget was going to be in October. Over the course of the first week of parliamentary sitting, the finance minister told us, in fact, it will be in November. One can speculate what's behind the delay of the budget, but talk a bit about what your polling is finding in terms of Canadians' understanding of Canada's budget context and what they're expecting from the Carney government.
Yeah, we put out some new numbers on Tuesday that I think my attempt was to go into some depth to understand what is the sort of the public perception of where we are, what they expect from the budget. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, like, let's keep in mind most people in this country are not paying that much attention, probably can't articulate in any detail, you know, what our fiscal situation is, but they have a sense of it. And what I get is one, that I think the Carney government so far has done a fairly good job priming much of the public to what is likely coming in that November budget. People believe we are in a fiscal mess. They don't believe we're going to get out of that fiscal mess in this from this document. The whole like invest austerity dichotomy, I don't know how to describe it, black white kind of framing of this seems to have broken through. When we ask people, like, what do you think the approach is going to be in this budget, more say that than any other version of what a budget might be. They expect to see big investments in defense and infrastructure and in housing. So in a way, I think the government, as much as it's sometimes criticized for how it communicates with the public, has done a fairly good job through intermediaries, at least priming most people who probably are paying attention to what's coming. Now, does that mean they're going to like what they see in that budget? They're going to react positively to it? I don't know. But I think the first step in a successful rollout is getting people not to be surprised by something. So unless there is something in that budget that is not being discussed or not being sort of set up, I think, the government so far has managed, it appears in the data I have, that conversation well enough. Now, again, we'll see whether the cuts that are to the federal public service or in any other way surprise people or get them to feel insecure. But at least right now, and again, that those perceptions exist without much shift in how people feel about the government itself, which is telling me that all this lead up to the budget isn't hurting the government at this point.
Take that up, Amanda, because I think one way to think about this is there are austerity Carneyites, the Bay Street types that were glad that he became liberal leader this year and was taking the party back to a more traditional, pragmatic center ground after a decade of the Trudeau-led Liberal Party. And then there are investment Carneyites, those who he pulled from the NDP, taking the NDP down from something like half of its historical level of popular support in the last election. Are you persuaded by the efficacy of this austerity investment dichotomy, as David describes it, as a pre-positioning for November's budget?
Yeah, I just want to. Can I just ask David? Do you mean the invest more? Um, what is it? Invest more, spend less. What is there? Is that that is actually working? People are repeating that to you in polling when you do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, when we ask them, like, what approach do you think this budget's likely to take? More say, I think it doesn't mean it's working. It means they
You
recognize
hear it? Okay.
they are hearing it.
Okay.
They believe there will be both investments and significant cuts to operations. Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't expect people to actually understand that that's what's coming, and they do. I think I would say more people do. And I would say the people paying attention probably are hearing it.
Okay. So the reason I asked this question is because I have been making fun of the invest more, spend less thing for well, since he started it, because it sounds like positively Seinfeldian to me. Like literally, if or on Veep, like if they went away and we're going to invest more and spend less. Like it makes no sense whatsoever. That being said, I often tell my clients who, politicians, leaders, whatever, repetition is key. And if you say the same damn thing over and over and over and over and over again, even if it makes no fucking sense at all, because it doesn't, because you can't do both. Like you can't like I'm gonna go to my credit card company and be like, I'm gonna invest more but spend less. Does that mean you can bring my balance down? Like that's not how it works. Like maybe it does. And I think part of the real advantage to Carney here is everybody he's the big central banker egghead. He's the guy that knows it. Like, in my personal relationship, like my partner is the numbers guy. He's an engineer. He likes spreadsheets. He's like, here's the budget. I'm like, sweet. I don't have to think about it. And I think a lot of Canadians are like, you know what? It's a mess out there. That guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Over to you. I'm going to focus on the 7 other things that are blowing up in my life. So I think that apparently is working. I really am curious to see for how long it goes, because we've talked about expectation setting, which I think this prime minister has a challenge with. And I also think he still has a challenge with his team around him and their ability to carry the ball on a lot of these major issues. But I also think pushing the budget date by a couple weeks, that's not usually a good sign in government when you're like,
Yes.
I'm going to delay the announcement for
Yes.
a couple weeks. The big one you guys are all looking for. So I mean, unless there's some great big shiny ball in there, or they're waiting on some negotiation with the U.S. But I can't fathom that, because you can't wait on anything. Like you can't pin anything to the U.S. government.
One of the things I think about too is they are also priming, I think, people to understand that the deficit's going to be massive. And
Yes.
that's despite significant cuts in
So-called
operational
austerity.
spending.
Do we
right?
think
So
three
what
bill
happens?
three decibels, like three numbers, like 100 billion? Like if it's because I'm curious, like the psychology between like 99.9 and like 101. Like what? Maybe Canadians don't give a shit, but to me, crossing that threshold is
I don't know if the number matters as much as the frame of it. Like, if are we in is this a crisis? Like, are we is this is and do we get our rating dropped by Moody's or something? Like what happens that starts to signal that like this is just the beginning? And I do think that like the government is setting up the conversation for this is just the start. Right now, we're not touching transfer payments. We're not touching OAS. We're not touching actually all the stuff that's really, really expensive, especially as our population's aging. So what happens if we're left with a $90 billion deficit, a weakening economy, and no real plan to get to balance? I think then it becomes something where, certainly the conservatives are going to take that, but Mark, this might be actually a strategy for the liberals to actually get people ready for deeper cuts in the 2026 budget.
Yeah, I would just put 3 points on the table, and the two of you can take them in any direction you want. The first on the magnitude of the deficit, as Amanda says, we'll wait to see, but it will likely be a big number. There's a lot of focus right now on spending. That is either incremental new spending or reductions in spending. A piece of the puzzle that's gone largely unaddressed in a lot of the analysis that we've seen in the lead up to the budget is on the revenue side. The Hub published an article last week by Lakehead University economist Livio De Matteo that estimates just by virtue of the slowdown in the economy that we're seeing, the revenue baseline should be something like $12 billion lower than it was in last year's fall economic statement. So even if the Carney government cuts $12 billion in incremental spending, all they're doing is offsetting the revenue losses that the government is likely to show in the budget. So he's being squeezed both on the spending side and on the revenue side, and that's why I think Amanda's right that the number may be huge, as President Trump puts it. The second, just on the date, I don't know what explains the delay in the budget, but I will say, having worked on previous federal budgets, I suspect the reason they've chosen the 4th is because the following week Parliament won't be sitting for
Mhm.
Remembrance Day. And so that gives an opportunity both for the government to avoid having to answer questions in QP about the magnitude of the deficit or possible spending cuts. It also gives an opportunity to ministers and the Prime Minister and others to roll out and to try to win that narrative war about the budget. And then just the last thing I'll say is the three of us, as we spoke last week, are millennials. Some of us came of age politically in the 1990s. And one of the interesting aspects of the cuts in the mid 90s was that Paul Martin and John Chrétien had a party to their right calling for more spending cuts. And one can't help but think that that's part of the liberal calculus here. Pierre Poilievre has been pretty clear that the conservatives are for big and deep spending cuts. And so you get the sense that as long as Carney and the government don't go as far as the conservatives, they can try to find a lane in the middle. And maybe that's this manifestation of the incomprehensible austerity versus investment dichotomy, as Amanda puts it. Do you guys want to weigh in on any of that, or any other thoughts before we move on?
I just have one thing there. I think if the conservatives are smart, they don't fully fall into that trap, right? Because that's the easy thing to say. Oh, those are the evil guys. They'd really cut. Like we're cutting OAS by 10, whatever.
Yes.
Let's say they do it. They cut it by 25. Like we're here
Yes.
just getting things ready. And I think what we saw with labor when they took the side of the workers against the government and moved to the left of the government, there should be like I think writ large, they need to say we need to get this thing under control because the base will go crazy if they don't. But there are programs that directly impact that like sub 100K, sub 50K, worker, like those folks they've really worked a lot to appeal to. And they should fight back against some of those pieces. So maybe they do pick one and say, you know what, cutting OAS is too far. This is not okay for the Carney government. Like, and just see if they can pick a couple pieces to say, as opposed to say writ large, they dive down into the details and pick a couple programs that impact key voter blocks, or just maybe they think it's who knows, maybe it's principle and they actually just think
Uh,
it's a wrong thing to do. That's what I
Amanda, can I stay with you for a minute on this,
yeah.
because I broadly agree, and I don't mind saying in full transparency, I've spoken to some conservatives about this. That on one hand, the party is advancing the case for deficit reduction. On the other hand, particularly in the aftermath of the election, it seems to me there's evidence that they need to nod to different issues to show a kind of more textured positioning of themselves. And one issue that I've championed in some of my public commentary is the case for expanding the Canadian disability benefit plan. Canadian disability benefit. We won't get into all the details, but it's a good program, but it's a pretty parsimonious program, and it seems to me it's a good issue where conservatives can demonstrate um, their compassion, but also a kind of understanding of the basic role of government. In terms of hierarchy of needs, ensuring that Canadians with disability are well supported ought to be at the top of the list, and some of the things that the government spends money on ought to be self-evidently below it. But a high-profile conservative told me, Amanda, that the tension in that message is a turnoff for them, that they don't want to be on one hand saying we need to reduce spending, we need to reduce the size of government, and on the other hand saying, but we also want to see spending on this issue or that issue or whatever, that they prefer a kind of cleaner form of communications, if I can put it that way. How would you respond to that?
Say that's foolish. And uh, that, if we have a federal government that's running around saying I can invest more and spend less, sure as shit you can find a way to say, hey, listen, we can cut the size of government, but people with disabilities need to live in dignity. Like, I think that's a
Yes.
very clear, easy, like honestly, if you can't figure your way through that communications trap, I think you should pack your bag and go home. Like, that is not a hard thing to do, and I think it actually shows a compassion to the conservatives that like historically the party we've had, but I think
Yes.
maybe lost to a certain extent. But you saw a little bit of that with Pierre Poilievre at those rallies where people crying, saying, I can't do this, I can't make ends meet, fentanyls, whatever. And I know those things moved him personally. So I think they'd be smart to pick those spots. And like, the thing is the PM may also take those things off the table. We've seen him in the last few weeks. The minute they move on immigration or whatever, he takes those chips and brings them home. But I think they should find their way to that
Da-
comms end.
David, I'm mindful of time here, and so I'm going to pivot to a question to you about this latest controversy over the Canadian Constitution in general and the notwithstanding clause in particular. We don't have to get into all of the intricacies here, but for listeners and viewers, on Thursday, Federal Justice Minister Sean Fraser submitted a factum to the Supreme Court of Canada, essentially asking the justices to provide guidance on what amounts to a set of constraints for the notwithstanding clause that would limit its use amongst the provinces. It generated a lot of interest online. I think it's fair to say a lot of interest amongst the hub community. Is that it, or does this have the potential in your mind to spill out into a bigger political issue?
Look, I think on the issue as it is now, I would say most people in the country aren't engaged on it, probably aren't thinking much about it, don't see it as a threat. But as I've learned, public opinion is as much constructed as it is naturally occurring. And so if you do have, premiers and others out there saying this is a deep threat to our, our autonomy, our ability to do what we want in the public interest, then it could become something that becomes a flashpoint, especially at a time when I think the federal government is trying to calm the interprovincial tension. This might be something that sparks a debate, especially given that in all likelihood we will see a PQ government elected in Quebec next year. It does seem to me to be a strange way to try to calm those waters. So I think my answer, Sean, is like let's wait and see, because it depends on how long and sustained
Yes.
this discussion goes, and ultimately what the court decides. And if the court decides it because the government made a compelling case to it, well, then that might initiate, I think, the kind of backlash that you're hearing in the smaller community, much larger across the country.
Amanda, you've been on the inside. What's your sense? What do you think is behind this decision on the part of the government? Is it like David said earlier about the recognition of Palestine? It may indeed be a principled decision that the government thinks that there is something that needs to be changed about the notwithstanding clause, or is this a nod to the party's progressive base? Is it motivated in part by, as we've been discussing, this balancing act the prime minister is doing between the austerity Carneyites and the investment Carneyites? Like, how are you thinking about what, on the face of it, seems like a pretty surprising decision, as David rightly puts it?
Oh, interestingly enough, when I talked to some liberals about this, because I thought, I'm like, this is quite provocative to do, right? And the root of this, as we know, is the challenge to Bill 21, and all different
Yes.
folks have brought. And I think they have a record number of interveners on this. The federal government, of whom is one of them, and the federal government's got to put something in to say, hey, we don't like this bill, and they tagged in this question around the notwithstanding clause, and the positioning to me was like this was the least provocative way they could engage in this conversation around this matter. Now I think
Interesting.
some real conspiracy theorists, which I don't believe this to be true, but I'm hearing it, say that this is a way of forcing some great constitutional crisis with vis-a-vis Quebec, and then we'll have to re-elect a liberal majority government in order to solve for it. I don't think people are playing that far 3D chess. I also just don't believe that the folks in government in Ottawa would cause a great constitutional crisis with Quebec. But the result of that may happen anyway, because
Yes.
in Quebec it's a huge provocation. They are pissed about it, and I think we can have a conversation about the use of the notwithstanding clause. Quebec's been using it freewheelingly forever. Now the other provinces started to pick it up. I think it'll be somewhat provocative in Alberta as well. But we should all hope that the Supreme Court just sort of says, well, this is part of the Constitution and like we're done and dusted. Because if they actually say we need to limit the use of this, I think we're going to have a very significant constitutional crisis at our hands at Quebec, where a separatist party is in the leadership. And I think that's no good for anybody. Now, folks may remember the Paul Martin government actually tried to remove this notwithstanding clause. It failed. Like they didn't go anywhere under their government. So I just think there's been a couple attempts. This is part of our governance structure, and we should leave it as is.
Yeah, well, thank you for permitting me to scratch my wonky notwithstanding clause itch for a minute. Before we wrap up, we have to ask. I have to ask about the launch of Avi Lewis's NDP leadership campaign, if for no other reason because it seems to me the future of the NDP looms over the future of electoral politics nationally, at least in English Canada. The Lewis campaign launch is nodding to what I would characterize as pretty left-wing ideas around state ownership of, amongst other things, grocery stores and so on. A nod in a way to Zora Madani's mayoral campaign in the city of New York. David, talk a bit about how New Democrats are seeing the world these days and the extent to which the Lewis's campaign launch is speaking to their conception of politics and their place in on the Canadian political landscape.
Well, I don't think I can speak to what Democrats are thinking, because there's not many of them right now that are willing to put their hands up. But I watched his launch video and encourage everyone watching or listening here to go watch it, because it was, one, really well done, I thought, and two, I think he's tapping into that mindset, Sean, that we've talked about before, where people are like, the world's a shit show, excuse my language, and he makes a fairly compelling case to who's to blame, and he's blaming corporate Canada primarily,
Yes.
and saying, look, there's deep inequality, you can't get ahead. It's calling it the, I think, impossible economy, which is an interesting way of framing, I think, the way people feel about life. In some cases, it's impossible to buy a house, it's impossible to get my head out of the debt that I'm in, it's impossible to imagine retiring. Like, those are all, I think, effective frames. And for once, I'll say, in been a while, I think if this is the path that the New Democrats broadly, and if Avi Lewis becomes leader, takes, there is a path for this kind of message in Canada right now. There is an audience for it, and it's not just in the traditional kind of left wing frame. And I think you're seeing evidence of it in other countries where a far left populist message is resonating. Germany, France, the UK, even if with Starmer in office, there's a nascent left flank that is deeply unhappy with many things that government's doing. And so I look at it and I say, well, the NDP still needs money. They still need, the ability to tell that message. But if that's the message they use, I think it's one that's crafted to the audience they're trying to connect with right now.
Amanda, what's your reaction to the Lewis launch, and how, if any way, should we interpret its meaning for the future of the NDP itself?
I'm just gonna. I started a donation campaign for the Lewis just so they can get to breathe some fucking life into the NDP. Sorry for swearing again, but we need, we need a. I actually think a three-party system is like a very healthy way in this, like, healthy political construct in this country, and I think a good healthy NDP is a good thing for Canada. I thought it was interesting. I remember. Do you remember when Obama started? I think it was 2008, and all of a sudden everybody was copying all the Obama stuff. So the Madami, like
Yes.
that strikes me as very similar. It's like all of a sudden everyone had text chains in '08 to tell people to vote and that kind of stuff. So, if every political party or globally starts to nationalize grocery stores, whatever. I kind of like, I don't know if that's a solution, but sure. Um, he doesn't speak French, to my understanding, like at all,
Interesting. Interesting.
which is a challenge for them because where the NDP actually had some reasonable success under Leighton and under Mulcair to a certain extent was they had, a good, like, a showing of some sort in Quebec, which should be a viable electoral place for them, and a leader that speaks no French, not even like kind of Carney French, to me would be. But we'll see. I mean, I'm happy that he's NDP royalty too, right, with his dad. So I think we'll see what comes of it. But I'm glad there's some life in the NDP.
Look,
Let me
Sean,
just, because please go.
just quickly, like I always like to go back to history like you do, and you mentioned the '90s earlier in our chat, so I bring back the '90s again. And in '93, the Liberals crushed and destroyed the NDP, as did the Reform Party. They were left with 9 seats. They got 7% of the vote. It sounds a lot like what happened in 2025.
Yes.
4 years later, they didn't break through and form government, but they did get 21 seats. They made major breakthroughs in Atlantic Canada, in large part because of the massive restructuring that the Liberals did to EI, to a bunch of
Yes.
programs. So if we count the NDP out, if you think they're dead, well, they've been here before and they've come back, and it's because of the fact there is no left right now in Parliament, giving the Liberals space to move right, but eventually that audience doesn't disappear. There's still going to be the demand, and so um, I don't necessarily think Avi Lewis needs to speak a word of French in order to become problematic for the Liberals in holding their I almost said majority, but keeping them in a precarious place in
Sure.
Parliament.
Yeah, great insight from both of you. Just a preposition for our listeners, viewers. We're going to spend a disproportionate amount of time, if it's up to me, over the coming months on the New Democrats because of some of the trends in Anglo-American progressivism and the extent to which they start to manifest themselves inside the NDP race. And then, as you've both alluded, the NDP just plays a crucial role in mediating our politics. It's self-evident that had the NDP been somewhere closer to historic norm, we'd be probably talking about Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre instead of Prime Minister Carney. So for those reasons alone, besides the fact that these debates are interesting, it'll be a topic that we continue to follow. Last week we wrapped up by experimenting with something you had heard or read or viewed that you thought may be of interest to our audience. Amanda, can I start with you?
Did my homework and have something ready to talk about this week because I had no chance to read very much. But read an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal recently. It was called "Why Marriage is Increasingly for the Affluent," and I've
Yes.
actually talked a little bit. And I know it's a hobby horse of yours, Sean, just around sort of the family constructs and how that's shifting. And basically, the whole article is how young people nowadays are getting married later and later, or it's only something for the rich because they think they have to achieve certain societal standards in order to kind of have that family unit. Same thing for kids, which I think is the greater crisis we're facing.
Yes.
So to me, I think it's a real, I think it's a huge societal problem that no one's really talking about, and we're actually not solving for even from a public policy perspective. So anytime these things kind of bubble up, I think it's important to talk about. I also don't think it's anti-feminist to talk about the importance of marriage and family and having children and things that have got great joy to my life that I did a lot later than most folks would. So anyway, I encourage people to read it. I think it's a really interesting take and also kind of tells you where young people's heads are at right now.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this. One of the reasons I've been so drawn to your commentary over the years is precisely because you're prepared to bring voice to these issues as a highly successful professional woman and a great mom. And I don't think our society talks enough about the extent to which we have cultural and public policy impediments to women in particular being able to be great moms and successful professionals, and we need to meet women where they are. And I think this is a conversation that that we need to have collectively. And so I'm grateful that you put it on the table here. David, how about you?
I'm going to cop out this week because I was obsessed with the Laver Cup, which is this tennis tournament over the weekend. Here, I'll just say, watch that Avi Lewis video. I think you're going to get a good sense of where our politics might be going in terms of the polarization between the left and the right, and where Carney fits into that.
I'll just wrap up by saying last week the Hub called out some of the excesses on the Anglo-American far left as they exhibit themselves in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And part of the reason I think we had credibility to do that is because at different times we've done the same with respect to the far right. And I will just say that last week at the launch of Parliament, we saw pretty big protests in and around Parliament to the far right of the Conservative Party. I've spoken to some Conservative parliamentarians who were called out by some of these forces. Uh, the the way in which Pierre Poilievre navigates this aspect of the party's far reaches on the right is something that I'm watching, something that I think a lot of Canadians are watching. It's not to say that by any means that Poilievre is responsive to these people, but they are kind of part of right-wing politics in Canada, and I think we were exposed to them last week on the streets in and around uh, Parliament Hill, and so as I said, we're equal opportunity critics here of the excesses on both extremes of our political spectrum, and I wanted to point out that some of those forces were present last week and present online, and I think there is an onus on Poilievre and people around him to to call them out. I think it's healthy to protect Canadian conservatism from some of those forces infesting it with what are really bad and awful ideas. And maybe with that, guys, hopefully we'll be back for a third episode. I think if the reaction episode one was any indication, we certainly will. I want to thank both of you for sharing your insights and wisdom. Amanda Galbraith, principal at Oyster Group, David Coletto from Halifax, the founder and CEO of Abacus Data. Thanks so much for speaking with me, and I look forward to catching up next week.
Thanks both. Take care.
Hey guys.
This video has been brought to you by Airbnb. Thank you, Airbnb, for sponsoring the Hub's YouTube channel this month. Governments, as Hub listeners and viewers know, are rightly focused on addressing Canada's housing crisis. But when they spend their time regulating short-term rentals like Airbnb, they're not focused on what matters most. According to Statistics Canada, the number of short-term rentals that could be potentially converted into long-term homes is just 0.6%. Yet Canada needs almost 6 million new homes by 2030 to achieve affordability. A closer look tells us that clearly building more homes, not regulating or restricting short-term rentals, is the only real solution. Learn more at airbnb.ca/closerlook.